Welcome everybody to tonight's program. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for Court in Session. And so tonight we'll be going through the history of the courthouse, and I'll just be making introductions and kind of handing it over to our speaker tonight, who I'll introduce in a second. I think pretty much everyone at this point in general is used to Zoom or something similar to it. And so if you have any questions at any point, feel free to either type them in the little chat box, which if you just kind of hover your mouse over, you'll see a little chat bubble at the bottom, and that'll open a little box on your right. You can type your question in there, or you can use the raise hand function, which is right near the little chat box icon. And that'll raise a little yellow hand next to your name. And so if at the end of the presentation your question hasn't been answered, then I can invite yourself to speak if you've still got your hand raised, or I will be gathering those messages in the chat box and asking Charlie your questions. So I will introduce our speaker tonight, who is Charles Rodenbough. This is a very summarized introduction, otherwise we'd be here all night, I'm sure. But Charlie, in a nutshell, is a scholar, a researcher, author, retired business executive, and a member of the board of directors for the Rockingham County Historical Society, which became the MARC for 60 years, and of which served 2 terms as president. Charlie has a wife, 4 children, 8 grandchildren and 3 great-grandchildren, and has many publications, is very much kept busy in retirement. 17 books since retirement, ranging from Governor Alexander Martin to Stealing Andrew Jackson's Head, which are very interesting subjects. So if you would like to add anything, please feel free, Charlie. Otherwise, I will hand over to you, and just let me know when you want me to share the screen.
All right, good evening, everyone. Tonight's program, Court in Session, really gives me a chance to talk about the building itself, our courthouse, which is now MARC, as a real physical history lesson for all of Rockingham County and the history of Rockingham County. So I don't think we sometimes don't accept it as that or think of it as that. We think of it in compartmental stories about different periods of time, rather than realize that it is really a span of time that covers the whole of Rockingham County history. And now MARC, as the new proprietor of the building, is continuing to preserve that history. So there's a continuity that goes along that we ought to be very conscious of, realizing that the county was started in 1785. Now, let me go back a little bit. That's only 3 years after the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, and essentially the end soon after at Yorktown of the American War, the Revolutionary War. The period of time had seen this area as the frontier. Really, when the war began, we were still frontier settling. People were pouring into the area, and they didn't stop coming in, but when they were coming in, they were frontiersmen, and they were really just building kind of subsistence living cabins, cutting down the trees, using that for the material to build the cabins, and then creating enough land, cultivated land, that they could live off the land. And eventually they had excess land and could begin to use that and sell it for some income. So that was true up to the beginning of the Revolutionary War. And then, of course, the war took all the focus away, in the sense that everything was upset. The areas of Randolph, Guilford, and Rockingham were all just filled with this Tory element. They were probably about 50-50. And realized that the Tory element at this time meant that the people living next door to each other, one could be Tory, one could be Whig, which was a dangerous situation for many reasons. But from a very local reason, it meant that if somebody had designs on his neighbor's land, one of the best ways to get it was to claim to the British that his neighbor was a rebel, or to complain to the rebels that he was a British sympathizer, and have his land confiscated in one way or another. So there was a lot of treachery. I'll call it country treachery, backwoods treachery, not the dynamic things that were going on worldwide, but just neighbor against neighbor. It was a rough time. So at the end, after the Battle of Yorktown, you had a country that had been thoroughly devastated, particularly North Carolina, and you had a public that was largely still divided and with a lot of bitterness going on. Now, Guilford County came into being in 1779 as a result of the regulator movement, really, where Governor Tryon was trying to isolate the regulators in one particular area in the Piedmont. And he took 2/3 of Rowan County, or from Rowan County, 1/3 from Orange County, put them together, and that was the strip that made up Guilford County, from the Virginia line to down below the Deep River. And then the Randolph County was, during the war in 1777, was cut off from the south because it was such a great distance to get to the courthouse. And then after the war at 1785, Rockingham County is cut off from the north. So let's go to first slide.
Sure, let me just share the screen and then I'll turn my screen off so I don't distract. Okay, I hope you can see that.
Right, there we go.
And I'm
all
going to
right.
stop the video and mute.
So we're going to cover really the history from 1785 until it became, in 2012, the home of MARC. December 28th, 1785, the county of Guilford was divided in the northern part. As I say, Randolph County had already been taken away in the south. In the north, they still had the same problem. They felt they were too far removed from the county seat of Guilford Courthouse. So the legislature really set up the Rockingham County in December. Now, when I say it set it up, the picture that you see there is one of the original documents that sets up the list of justices of the peace. And the appointments of the justices of the peace were important on this date. They had to get them appointed because they were the ones who really dispensed law and order. They were the local courts. The people who headed them up were the most important people in the county. The Clerk of Court was interesting because that was Thomas Henderson, and Thomas Henderson he was the brother-in-law of Governor Alexander Martin, and he had been the Clerk of Court in Guilford County, and he resigned that job when Rockingham was established, and he came over as the first clerk of Rockingham County. The sheriff was John May, and his deputy was John Hunter Jr., the son of the regulator James Martin, or James Hunter, excuse me. Adam Tate was the coroner, Abraham Phillips was the surveyor. He was a lawyer also. John Hunter was the register of deeds. John P. was the ranger. William Clark, Esquire, also a lawyer, was the entry taker. Nathaniel Williams, who later became governor of the state of the area that became Mississippi, he was the attorney, the state's attorney or prosecutor. There were overseers of the roads for each area of road that existed all over the county. And you had the district and the constables appointed. So before the county was really an operation, all these people as an organization were set up. Next slide. The first session was the next year, 1786, in February, and it was said to have been at the home of Adam Tate. Now, there's a lot of mystery still in this area, a lot of research still to be done physically, but they needed the best building available near the center of the county because there were no county buildings at that time. So they had to get a place to meet, in other words, and his home was relatively near the center of the county on the north side of Dan River. But since no public buildings were available, they had to first raise enough tax money in order to build them. So they had to meet somewhere else, and it was said to be near Eagle Falls at Adam Tate's house. Now, the Dan River ran through the center of the county, and Governor Alexander Martin, and this is important to how the organization got put together, he had just completed his last term as governor. After that was his 6th term as governor, 1-year terms, and he returned to Guilford County and established the town of Martinville at the courthouse over there in May of 1785. So he was very busy in establishing the courthouse in Guilford County and at the same time setting up the county to the north, which was going to be Rockingham County. And he had 640 acres up on Jacobs Creek at Dan River, where he had built a home for his mother and his younger siblings, so he already had a place to retire. Thomas Henderson, the clerk of the court, as I say, moved over to become clerk of Rockingham. And it's interesting, and even the setup was so detailed that the sheriff was directed to appear at the first meeting of the court with a wand not less than 8 feet long and 1 inch in diameter, painted white. So that's a relic we don't have anymore, but a replica certainly should come out of that. Next slide. To show you how quickly these things were changing around here, here is a document, an indenture in July of that year, in which you see that the document is actually written on a form that is a royal form. This is the kind of form they would have used in England anywhere at the same period of time. And they were very frugal and they were using up the supply that they had. So this indenture in July of 1785 actually used the British form to produce. And this particular document is down at the community college in the archives down there, where a number of these first papers that of the county were given and were deposited some time ago. Anyway, they're down there. Next slide. Adam Tate's kind of an interesting story. I'm going to tell you a number of different local stories connected with the courthouse at different times in order to hope to kind of bring it alive as a place. Things went on here, and they were interesting things, and they were centralized in the sense that this was where much of the action was for much of the history of the county. But Joseph Tate had died in 1772, just before the Revolution began. His wife was Allie Hunter, and she was an aunt of James Hunter and of Alexander Martin. So this family was so influential in the beginning of this county that they were the power structure. They were the, if you want, it has been used as a probably a pejorative, but they were frequently called the courthouse gang. Because they did center a lot of power in this particular family. So Joseph Tate married into that family. His son was Adam Tate, and Joseph willed him land on the west side of Dead River, 350 acres plus. And soon after he was willed the land, right before the war began, Adam Tate went to British-held Florida. And he was there when the war broke out, and he was stuck. He could not return because he was considered a British agent, or if he'd come back in, he would have been suspected of being a British agent. So he was stuck in Florida. In 1777, during the war, his brother died, and he also left land to Adam. So he acquired 1,000 more acres, which was the Mulberry Island plantation. In 1779 and 80 sessions of the legislature, in several of the sessions and committee meetings, Alexander Martin was now president of the Senate of North Carolina, and the petition came to the legislature to restore the citizenship of Adam Tate, excuse me. So Tate had just gotten back into Rockingham County. He had missed all the war, but he was obviously considered a British sympathizer when he came back. And there must have been an awful lot of effort made in order to get his land to be chosen for the courthouse. In fact, it may have been almost appropriated because they could accuse him of being a British sympathizer. But the courthouse site on Mulberry Island was near Eagle Falls, which was the other physical location there. Next. The first courthouse came in 1787. The General Assembly authorized the construction of the first courthouse, and it was called, the location was called Rockingham Courthouse at first. It was on the land of a man named Charles Mitchell. It was east of Rockhouse Creek, and the contractor to build it, we know, was Richard Sharp. Excuse me. And in August of 1787, Constantine Perkins and Charles Galloway had bought the land from Mitchell, and they donated 1 acre to the county around this building that was being built. So that's the title that came through. The first session was in the unfinished courthouse in November of 1787, and the construction was not finished until the following year. Next. We have a relic from that time. We believe that this is one of the benches from the courthouse, from the first courthouse. Did we skip a slide there? Because I want to, yeah, well, let me pull this in now. One of the amazing things we have as a document actually exists in the records of Guilford Courthouse. In 1787, 1792, Guilford County decided it needed to build a building to replace the one that had gotten shot up during the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. And they knew that the contractor, Richard Sharp, had just completed the building over in Rockingham when they were building theirs. And they wanted to be sure that they had gotten their money's worth. So they sent two of their commissioners over to Rockingham County to compare physically the two courthouses, the one they had just built in Guilford and the one that had been built for most of a year in, or several years in Rockingham County. Now, that document is so valuable because it is detailed about the descriptions of both courthouses. And their conclusion was that Rockingham County had gotten more for their dollar than they had. But to indicate to you how detailed these descriptions are and what valuable records they are of exactly what this building looked like, here's just a quote from this document and in their description of Rockingham. We, the subscribers, have inspected Rockingham County Courthouse and found it to be 36 feet 6 inches and 1/2 in length, 24 feet 2 inches in width, and 11 feet 3 inches to the underside of the cornice. The porch is 9 feet 4 inches in length and 6 feet wide, weatherboarded with poplar in an ordinary manner, sealed with pine planks 10 inches broad, milled into the fascio under the cornice. And it goes on. It describes even how the benches were made and how the court was set up. So that's a valuable document. It's a real snapshot of what we had at this time in Rockingham County. And then let's go to this next slide. Here we have, we think, the only relic out of the courthouse itself, courthouse building, and it is the bench, and it is as described in that record in 1792. So we're almost certain this is the bench. We know from local tradition in Wentworth that it is supposed to have been retrieved from the fire in 1906. So evidently it had just been passed down as the different courthouses were built. Next. Well, I reversed the slides. This is what I had just described here. The record from John Rankin and Samuel Bell is on the right-hand side, and you can see how I needed to read it because it's very small, but it was the small village that was called Rockingham County Courthouse. Next. Now, in relation to Martinville over in Guilford County, they have made this imaginative drawing out of the description that they have in that same document of Guilford at the battleground. So we really have almost exact data on what the first courthouse looked like in very great detail. And I've made some contacts in Guilford and have talked to Cy Rothrock, and they have promised me that they're going to one day do a scale model so that we can have it at MARC. Next. Wentworth now comes in 1792. They come over to measure the courthouse, but by 1794, they had established a post office that was called Rockingham Post Office. So the name of the place, instead of Rockingham County, is Rockingham Post Office now. And the General Assembly, 2 years later, establishes the town of Wentworth on 40 acres of Robert Galloway's 125 that he had that he then sold the entire 125 he'd gotten from Mitchell. He sold, and the county divided it into 21 lots, which was the first layout of the town of Wentworth. Next. This map is a little bit later than that. You see more than 21 lots here, but essentially the streets as laid out were as laid out in 1794. The main street coming through, you'll see a little bit left of center, the courthouse square there. You'll see where the angle of the street that goes down between the old jail and the store that is across from the courthouse. That the street went down there behind the tavern. This was how the town was laid out along the ridge on the east side of Rockhouse Creek. Okay. Now we have all this detail about what the original courthouse looked like, but we really don't have much record of detail of all the things that went on there. You can imagine they had all this organization to do, and that it was a very volatile kind of building because so much took place there, both on a personal basis and an individual basis, individual landowners coming in to get their property recorded. There were a few major or not major, but a few substantial court cases during that period. We've got a description that was made by Alexander Sneed in 1810 that appeared in the Raleigh newspaper that was now owned by our aforementioned Thomas Henderson. And in that article, which was an early description of Rockingham County, he called the courthouse a tolerable wooden courthouse painted. That was as much as he got out of him. So the earlier description, 16 years earlier, is much more detailed. But by 1823, the commissioners felt they had to replace this courthouse. It wasn't big enough. Inside, it only had one large room and another room for the court records. So a commission was appointed for the construction, and by 1825, apparently it was finished, and it was the commissioners were to sell the old courthouse and the jail. So that's the first courthouse. Next slide. Looking at the county in this period on the Price-Strother map, which is an 1808 map, you can see that it's interesting. Right in the center of the Rockingham County, you'll see the crossroad there, which is Wentworth. But to the left of it, or to the west of it, you'll see that Danbury, the plantation of Alexander Martin, immediately to the right, or to the left of it, is bigger than Wentworth, as it's mapped out here by Strother when he comes through. Danbury was even larger than Wentworth. Of course, we don't have, by this time, we're just about to have Madison. We've got Leakesville, and Leakesville is shown on the map as at the crossing of the Smith River immediately above Wentworth. But you see the counties surrounding there. Stokes was still part of Surry County, so we bordered Surry County at the time. And then to the bottom, you'll see Guilford County, and in the middle, you'll see their courthouse town, which was now Martinville. Next. If you were a Virginia person and looking down, this is a map, a Virginia map, and it was they went a little bit over the county or the state border and picked up a few things in North Carolina, and it really gives us in 1826 is kind of a view of how a Virginian looking down his nose at the poor people in Rockingham County might have drawn this area. To him, the only important places were Leakesville, which you see right in the center, and as you see again, Danbury is larger than Wentworth. Wentworth is just a small post road. Now, one of the important things about a courthouse at that time was it became the county post office. It literally was that. There was no post office at any of the towns of the county. And at that time, the post or the carriage which delivered the postage or the post went really from county seat to county seat. Next slide. So here we see a small section of the post roads, they were called, that were covered at that time by the postman. He's the nearest thing to today's postman. And you'll see right in the center that odd-shaped four-sided area. You'll see Martinville at the bottom. You'll see to the left, you'll see Germanton, which was the courthouse for a combined Surrey Stokes. You'll see at the top Rockingham Courthouse. You'll see to the to the right, you'll see Caswell, and immediately below it, you'll see Hillsborough. So essentially what it's saying is the one government thing that was done at that time, when we know the post office was an early part of this country, was to set up mail delivery, and it was brought to the county seat. So the post office was here. If you lived in the county of Rockingham, periodically you made a point of going to the court, to Wentworth, and picking up your mail at the post office. Next. The second courthouse down, 1728, the builder we know, again, this time was William Childs. We know it was, or probably two-story, it was a brick building. And it had a single chimney, apparently in the middle, that by 1847, when they made some improvements to the building, they took down the chimney and, of course, had pot-bellied stoves around that courthouse. And because they were doing it with stoves, they put a metal roof on top. By 1860, they had new carpeting and they put in the bell and modifications. They called it just fixtures. And this building was in use from 1825 to 1906 when the fire came. Now, we don't have any picture of this. We don't have any description in the Guilford County records or anywhere else. So we're not sure exactly what it looked like. But looking at the next slide, you'll see that you have, next slide, you have two examples that we could go back to make some projection of what it might look like. The one on the right is the old courthouse at Germanton. This was before Stokes County was split, with Forsyth County being the south part and Stokes County being the top, and the establishment of Danbury up in Stokes County. So this was right in the middle of the courthouse square at Germanton. Roads went around both sides of it. And it's a pretty simple building, as you can see. You can't read it there, but over the door in that white area, it says courthouse. On the left, we have a really difficult to see, but it is the shadow picture of the courthouse that they built in Danbury in 1848. So those would have been the buildings that were closest to represent what the second courthouse would have looked like in Rockingham County. Next. Now we come to the Civil War. The location of the county and all that was going on in organizing the Confederate government, of course, was centered for us in Wentworth. The most interesting incident of the war, I think, happened on April 20th, 1861, and we have details of all of this. County Court was to open that day, and it opened with fife and drums, it said, coming in from several directions, and 150 volunteers assembled. Wheeler Hancock, who was a veteran of the Mexican War, was the senior official with military roots, so to speak, and he was the one that assembled the 150 volunteers. He pulled out two young lawyers, Alfred Moore Scales and Thomas Settle Jr., and put them at one side, and then the rest of the 150 or 148 formed up into two companies, Company H for Scales and Company I for Settle, and they became part of the 13th North Carolina Regiment, and they marched off north for training. It must have been a very dramatic day. You can imagine that most of Rockingham County must have been there to see their boys off. But this was how the Civil War began on April 20th, 1861 in Wentworth, North Carolina. And the flag that you see there is a flag that was made locally for the local unit. Now, we don't think it was made for one of these two units, but probably one that came out of the Reidsville area. But we do have this flag, and it is down at Wentworth, very perfectly restored. Next. Now, of course, the Civil War went on, and as the war was coming to an end, 1864, we had an election. It was a very difficult election because obviously the war was coming to an end and the South had lost. So we were going to have an election at a time when the sides hadn't completed their effort at a war. And William Holden, who had been the most recent governor, and former Governor Zebulon Vance, or Holden would become governor. He was actually the leader of the peace movement at that time. So you had the two sides in the war, the number of people in Rockingham County who were really in favor of the Union and not the Confederacy. Their sympathies ran that way. There was a stump speech in Madison and then another in Wentworth. Vance was to speak and Thomas Settle was going to speak. Thomas Settle, the one who marched off with his troops in Company I in the 13th North Carolina, had come back from the war. He'd actually resigned his commission and come back. So opposed was he to the war once he got into it and saw what was going on. So he was a part of the peace movement, and he was speaking for Holden. Now, in Madison, there have been a lot of threats going on between these two competing sides of what was going to happen. And a plan was hatched in which they were going to carry out a beating or even were going to kill possibly Judge Settle. A fellow appeared at the doorway in Wentworth at the hotel, and he was threatening Settle. So let me read from a description of that circumstance, which I think is really fascinating. It says that, but the turbulent war element, and this was contemporary to the time after the war, just after the war was being written, was in the ascendancy in Rockingham County, and the crowd had made it up to attack Judge Settle and even to kill him, or best him unmercifully, beat him unmercifully. Excuse me, this typing is a little hard to make out. Threats had been made in Madison the day before, and subsequent events proved that a leader had been selected and a plan devised to carry out the bloody designs of the mob. Judge Settle occupied a room in a long, low row of buildings attached to the one hotel. That's Wright Tavern. In front of his office, as his room was called, was a small dooryard, it's called, extending probably 10 feet to the fence. This ran about 200 feet along the public square in front of the other buildings. He sat quietly at work in his room when a gigantic fellow appeared at the door and used to him insulting language. The judge ordered that the man away and out of the yard, but the latter, by this time being filled with the mob, in other words, backed up by the mob, who exhibited great excitement, the big fella replied that it was a public hotel and he had a right to be there. Being once more commanded to depart and not going, but continuing his abusive words, Judge Settle struck him in the face with his clenched fist. Immediately, the crowd closed in. Actually, they took all the spokes off the fence, and they were using them as threatening clubs. And a dozen hands grabbed the indomitable lawyer, Settle. The turmoil became furious. At this important crisis, Judge Settle saw pointed toward the crowd over his shoulder from behind a silver-plated pistol gleaming in the sunlight, held in the nervous grasp of Settle's brother, David Settle. And as the muzzle of the weapon swept the front of the mob, every hand dropped and the surging crowd fell back. The brothers had never agreed in politics, but at this particular time, one came to the rescue of the other. And that dramatic scene happened between the courthouse and Wright Tavern. Next slide. Now, oops, back to my notes here. Okay. In this period, we had going on, as you can see from what I just read, that there was turmoil at every court meeting because these people were still, it was like the Tories and Whigs at the time of the Revolution. You had the rebels and you had the Unionists in Rockingham County following the Civil War. In Caswell County, you had the real outbreak of one of the major incidents in North Carolina history from the Klan in 1870. It became so bad that Governor Holden had to, excuse me, I'm watching my slide and not my notes here, but Governor Holden had to order Captain Kirk, before he was in his starship, I guess, to Caswell County in order to put down the mob or the work of the Ku Klux Klan over there. Now, all that was boiling in the next county. One of the people right at the center of that was a man named Chicken Stevens, John W. Stevens. He was born in 1835 down near Bruce's Crossroad, but his family moved to Wentworth, and they lived in the house just on the east side of the courthouse building itself. By 1860, he was living in Wright Tavern and as a widower, and he married while he was in Wentworth. He was a member of the Methodist Church, but he was given the name Chicken because the story was that he had stolen chickens from his mother's chicken yard and had sold them. And it was a name that was not meant to praise him in any way, but it stuck with him into history. He, after the war, moved to Caswell County and to Yanceyville, and he became head of the Republican Party in Caswell County, which was called the Radical Party, interestingly enough today. But Chicken Stevens was the one person among the radical Republicans that had absolutely no respect in Caswell County. Anyway, in 1870, in May of 1870, they were having a meeting at the courthouse in Yanceyville, and although a lot of the details will never be known, it was known that they assassinated Chicken Stevens. They hung him in the courthouse. It was held as a secret among KKK leaders in Caswell County for years, but the story finally came out as his deathbed confession after some years later, within a decade, I guess, probably. Now we'll go to this slide. The campaign then of 1876 comes along. All this is brought at the earlier incident in front of Wright Tavern, and now the KKK and both Caswell and Rockingham were very active at this time. And in the 1876 100th anniversary of the United States, Judge Zebulon Vance, who had previously been governor, was running against our Judge Thomas Settle Jr. They had known each other at UNC when they were students there. But the Klan had made plans to kill Settle during the campaign. They were carrying on what has been called the Battle of Giants because they went through all of North Carolina, and in 3 months, they had 69 addresses in 65 counties. In other words, the Lincoln-Douglas debate had gone on in 1870 or 1860. But now this was being repeated in North Carolina with the Vance-Settle debates. The election was really a very heated one, and Settle had become, in the meantime, the father of the Republican Party in North Carolina. So it was the beginnings of the Democrats under Vance, who were the former Confederates, and the Unionists under Settle, which had become the Republican Party as part of the Whigs and the old Democratic Party. The Battle of Giants went right down to the end, and Vance won 118,000 to 104,000, a very close election. But the dramatics of that and the connection with the courthouse is always a fascinating story. I want to say at this time that this whole period of Rockingham County history has, I don't want this to be offensive to anybody, but over the period of the 100 and some years since the Civil War, this whole story of what went on during Reconstruction has always been kept under wraps by both the white community and the Black community, because both had interest in just not talking about it. And what happened during that period is very, very significant to the history of North Carolina and to the county itself. And of course, the KKK was a secret organization, so there was much secrecy involved with that. All this area of time between the end of the Civil War and the beginning of the First World War really should be looked into more, and I hope will be by researchers in time to come. This, next slide. This was Wentworth then in 1900. But before I get into that, I got one more tragic story to tell you. In fact, I've entitled it A Gruesome Story, and something I've written about it, A Gruesome Sight. Tildy Carter was married to Nat Carter, and he was a beloved slave of the Galloways down in Eagle Falls. After the war and after the emancipation, he moved to Madison, and from the ability that he learned, or what he was trained on the plantation as a shoemaker, he went into business in Madison as a cobbler. One night, his wife, Tildy, who had also been a slave down there, and two other, well, actually 6 men, joined together and decided to kill Nat. Now, what they were doing was they thought Nat had some money because his business was one of the only Black businesses that was operating was really flourishing at that time. So he had some money. What it would have been very small, but enough for it to be coveted. So they supposedly or were charged with having strangled him at his cobbler's bench in Madison and taken his body. It was a snowy day, and they had taken it out along the Dan River to Pine Hall and dropped it in the woods out at Pine Hall. Well, it was discovered, and they were charged with the murder. They were convicted in Wentworth, in the courthouse in Wentworth, and Tildy and 2 of the members of the group, I think the others turned state's evidence on the 3, but the 3 were convicted and sentenced to be hanged in Wentworth. The hanging drew 10,000 people, and it was a very dramatic event. And one of the most interesting records that we have of it comes from John Motley Moorhead, who was then a 12-year-old boy in Leakesville. Now, this is John Motley Moorhead, the one who gave the money for the Moorhead Planetarium and at the UNC and the Moorhead Hospital in Leakesville, Old Leakesville. But he was a 12-year-old boy at this time. This is in He's recalling it as having happened in 1881. And I want to read you this from a letter he wrote back to Raleigh when they questioned him, or he was asked in 1934 about this particular event. So here is a 12-year-old boy giving his description of what happened that day. He says, "My parents were both away from home at the time, and I was staying with Mrs. Walker, an old aunt of mine. When the military company was called to attend the hanging, now the military company was a Leakesville company, and it had just been to a celebration up in Reedsville, but they were then set up to appear and to create law and order during this hanging when they knew that a lot of people were going to gather. And as I say, it is estimated that 10,000 people gathered there. The site, by the way, is approximately where the community college is now. So this description applies to just that location. The military company was called to attend the hanging. I kept very quiet about it, but slipped out of the house very early in the morning. I went home, got my uniform. He was a junior member of this military company, and a pony, and joined the company as it was leaving Leakesville for Wentworth. They had their guns and 12 rounds of ball cartridges each, and formed a hollow square around the two wagons which conveyed the three Negroes from the jail to the gallows. As I did not have a gun, I rode my pony inside the square with the captain and the prisoners. So he was right there where the action was going on. With a gruesomeness which would not be permitted today, the three Negroes were dressed in their white shrouds and were sitting on the coffins with the ropes around their necks, and the sheriff in the front wagon with the woman, and two deputies in the second wagon with the two men, holding the ropes like carrying a dog on a leash. I was still inside the hollow square at the gallows when the three of them were hanged at one time. They all confessed, made statements on the gallows, and one Negro prayed all the way from the jail until the trap fell. I remember very distinctly how the bodies turned round and round due to the twist of the ropes. I hope that wasn't too gory a story for you. All right. So in 1900, this is what Wentworth looked like. The courthouse from 1825, we believe, was still in existence in a different form. There had been an extension in 1881 of 20 feet at the rear. And you can see in this drawing very clearly right in the center, the courthouse with the bell attached on the top of it. At that time, it had just been there for 20 years. At that time, the bell. This was what it looked like. And right across, you'll see the hotel, which is Wentworth, or which is Wright Tavern. The jail, which is not quite in the location that it is now. But you'll also see all the houses that existed in Wentworth at the time. So as the century turned, this was the town of Wentworth. The same street that was laid off and the streets going down beside the courthouse are still in existence. Next slide. And down in the valley, there was what was called the natural showers. That was down in where people went for curative waters down behind the courthouse. Next. So we believe that this was the courthouse building that from 1825 that existed until 1906. Now in this picture, if you look down in the right-hand corner, you'll see familiar building. It was at this time the law office, the Humphrey Law Office. And it was became many things, including the post office at a later time. As I say, the commissioners in 1881 had expanded this building. It was much larger. And, on October 2nd, 1906, the fire destroyed the courthouse. Now, it caught fire from a fire in the adjoining Withers store, which might have been the Chicken Stevens house, but I'm not sure on that. The building was obviously lit from the roof, the fire coming over from the adjoining building. So the citizens of Wentworth had enough time to get in, and almost all of the records were saved out of the courthouse while the fire was going on. And obviously that bench was pulled out at that time and it was saved. So when the next morning they looked, they had nothing but the shell of a building at the center of Wentworth. Next slide. This is the Judge Humphreys Law Office and what we now call the annex to the Wright Tavern, where for a while we had the office of MARC. The building was really built for Judge Ira Humphreys, and he lived at Wright Tavern at the time, as did Hugh Reed Scott, who was another lawyer. Both of them were bachelors. They were very fastidiously served at the court, at the tavern, and Scott particularly did not like cold silverware, so his silverware was always warmed in the stove at the tavern and brought into him in a wrapped napkin. That's another detail that kind of gives interest to the stories and the command of the lawyers. Next. Okay, let's take a break for a minute. Just a second. Let me breathe and make sure I haven't passed over something I should have taken, and give everybody a chance to breathe.
Let me just see if there's anything on the chat box. I don't think there's anything that's coming up for questions. Let's have a quick look. And no raised hands. We have no questions so far. But let me. Oh, yeah. Sorry, I'm just making sure it was working. But yeah, we haven't got any questions yet, Charlie, but feel free if anyone does want to put any questions in that chat box or raise their hand, then please do. Just a comment from Susan Nelson that she's very much enjoying it. So thank you, Susan. I appreciate you being here tonight with us.
Okay, I went a little over on that first session, and this next one will be short. So let's go ahead and move into it. First. Okay. So we had the new courthouse that was built in 1907. Now, this was not a simple act. The courthouse had burned. In Reedsville, you had a boom town. The railroad in the previous century coming to Reedsville had brought all sorts of industry to it, in tobacco and some textiles. And of course, James Turner Moorhead had brought textiles to Leakesville, and it was a booming textile town. And on the west part of the county, you had Madison and the beginnings of Mayodan. And you had a real conflict there, just as they had back when the courthouse, when the Rockingham County was established, because they were saying, wait a minute, this little country town out here with our courthouse, we lawyers don't want to have to go all the way out there to take care of the business of court. So Reedsville thought that the court should be moved, and they made moves in the legislature to have the courthouse and court moved to Reedsville. Well, Leakesville would have none of it, and they fought them in the legislature. And the legislature said, well, it's a Rockingham County problem. Why don't you have a referendum? Well, none of them wanted to have a referendum because they thought that would come into a knockdown, drag-out battle. And John M. Galloway, who was chairman of the Board of Commissioners at that time, was so intent that if Reedsville was pulling this act to get the courthouse over there, he wanted it in Madison. And he actually started a building up where the shopping center is, between Madison and Mayodan. And until the shopping center came in, the basement and some of the foundation of that building actually existed. But here's Wentworth with this shell of a building in the middle. They were having to meet in other buildings in Wentworth, and there weren't many to choose from, or in homes for the different lawyers' offices. Next slide. This kind of battle was finally resolved when they decided, well, we can't move the courthouse out of Wentworth, but we're not going to build within the shell of the courthouse. We're going to build a new courthouse. That was the kind of compromise that they worked out. And Rockingham County, as all of you will know and have experienced right up to the present time, there's always competition between the municipalities and the county center. And it still exists today, or remnants of it today. They hired an architect out of Washington, Frank P. Milburn, and a builder who was B.F. Smith Fireproof Construction Company. And his superintendent was Mr. Davis. And if you go in the courthouse building today and go to the stairs that go up to the second floor, you'll see marble plaques on each wall. One of them lists Frank P. Milburn as the architect and from Washington, D.C., and the other one lists B.F. Smith Fireproof Construction Company as the builder out of Washington, D.C. So we've got a lot of information about the different buildings, but at this time, at the turn of the century, many of the courthouses around North Carolina were being rebuilt as new courthouses because there was a new economic situation by that time, and the county courthouses mainly were pre-Civil War courthouses, and it was time to rebuild them. Next slide. So completed in February of 1909, this is essentially what the courthouse looked like at that time. You'll see right in the middle of your picture, the well is the little building with the peaked roof right in the middle. And between that well, and that was the public well, and between that well and the courthouse building, you'll see a house behind the gentleman walking in the street. And that apparently, that may be Chicken Stevens' house. And beside it was the courthouse, was the store that burned and started the fire in 1906. While this was all going on and they were completing the new courthouse, they used the Presbyterian Church as a courthouse and local buildings, even homes, as various offices. Milburn at the same time designed a water and sewer system for the courthouse and the jail. And of course, that in various forms has been the water and sewer system for Wentworth since then. There was a coal furnace in the basement of this new building, so it was a coal heated building that he designed for them. Next slide. Over the years, there have been a number of additions to the courthouse, an extension, or the each side of the court building itself. On the lower level were rooms added for the various court functions or the courthouse functions. And then the extension out back was added. And then the new building, next slide. This is the way, getting ahead of myself here. The one most interesting story connected with that building itself during the time of the courthouse happened on July 26, 1932. Smith Reynolds was the youngest son of Richard J. Reynolds, the tobacco magnate. He was very much interested in flying. He was 18 years old. He had all the money he could ever want in his life, and he wanted a prize wife. So he married from Hollywood Libby Holman, who was actually herself from Cincinnati, but had become a well-known star of the in the style of the time, which was music that was very sexy and was very much an adaptation of what they'd heard from the minstrel shows, and that kind of came out to create the period of the torch singers. The torch singers, there were a number of them, and they were very popular up until the Second World War. But Libby Holman was, of course, older than Smith Reynolds, and they were having a party at Rodenbough House in Winston-Salem, which was the Reynolds house. And during the party, Smith was upstairs and a shot rang out, and everybody ran up, and Libby was screaming over his body that he'd shot himself. Well, there was immediate suspicion, because also in the house was the man she was now having an affair with, who was from Walnut Cove. And so the newspapers in Winston-Salem had a real time trying to get the information about the events reported, because the Reynolds family didn't want any of this to go public. So they were paid to have it hushed up in every way. Eventually, the sheriff of Forsyth County charged Libby with murder. And Libby was the headline at that time, or actually on the day of the death, was that Libby Holman is moaning low. That was the headline in the Winston-Salem paper that day. Moaning Low was her famous torch song, and she had become very well known. It was her song that everybody was singing, is popular. Here you see on the left a picture of Libby being ushered out, and as you see, they're trying to conceal her from the press. And on the right, you'll see a picture of Libby in the courthouse when she was arraigned in Rockingham County, because things got so hot in Winston-Salem that they couldn't get a jury in Winston-Salem. So she was arraigned in and brought over and put in jail briefly in Rockingham County. And then before the hearing, she was taken over to Wright Tavern and allowed to refresh herself and have some sort of drink or something. But she famously came out on the porch at Wright Tavern, smoking a cigarette, and you can see her here veiled. You can just imagine she's the vamp of the age, and all this dramatic. The people from the press must have been from all over America in Wentworth on that particular day, and very dramatically, she took out her cigarette, dropped it on the ground, and crushed it with her high heel as she went across. For years, that cigarette butt was saved in Reidsville, but I think it's disappeared by now. But that's another story that brings to life what kinds of things went on in the courthouse building. Next. This is the building in 1979. You'll see here the two additions that have now been completed in the front. You'll see they've got the extension in the back. This is more or less the kind of courthouse that many of us remember what it was really operational as a courthouse. Next. Then the addition was added to the back that was the jail and the sheriff's department. And this was the building that in 2013 became the property of MARC. And it has been ever since. Next slide. Here we are as it presents itself today as the home of MARC. Next slide. This is the floor plan of the front of the bottom floor, the rotunda you see, and the back addition, which became the Register of Deeds office, and the below it, or the Clerk of Court's office, and the Register of Deeds in the basement under it, as the addition. And you see it's the Old Courthouse by then. Next. This is the new courthouse as we have it today. And so MARC is carrying on the traditions of the Rockingham County Courthouse in a new form as an archival record, and we are keeping as much as we got originally of the original courthouse. Unfortunately, before MARC got it, they had torn out the old courthouse where Libby Holman had been arraigned, and other things went on that was from the era of the spittoon and the crowded people coming in to hear sensational trials. But so that part of it has not been preserved, but we have preserved and used a lot of the old courthouse, and the effort of MARC is to continue to preserve the building, as much of that fabric of the building as can be preserved, and inside to keep the record continually of Rockingham County. So that's tonight's presentation. Are there any questions now, Matthew?
Okay, let me just bring myself back on this one. Yeah. I have a raised hand function, so from Susan Nelson. So if you'd like to speak, you just unmute and you can speak your question. Or not. There we go. Well, I'm not sure if Susan's able to, or internet connection or what, but if anyone does have any other questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box, or you can just raise your hand. But yeah, thank you, Charlie, for a very kind of eclectic history, I guess, of the courthouse and the area that it occupies. I mean, one of the great things about the courthouse is that it lent itself very well to being a museum, with those archival, what are now our archival vaults were used for the deed of records. So they were pretty much used for similar things, preserving some of those records, of which we have many now, and slowly have managed to get some of that history back. And even in this year, actually, we've managed to get some of those things back that were ripped out of that remodel in the 1980s from that original courtroom. So yeah, we're excited to kind of get those back and catalog those, and hopefully one day have them in a display.
Good. Well, I told you earlier that in your honor, I'm sitting in front of a picture of Queen Victoria. And also I realized that my daughter's mannequin is sitting back there, so that may distract some people, but and her liquor cabinet, I guess. But you know, the thing, why don't you tell them a little bit, if you will, about your contacts with Wentworth, Charles Watson Wentworth, and there's a Rockingham.
Yeah, I mean, this is something we touched on last year's gala. Of course, trying to build those connections with some of that early history of Rockingham County and why it was called Rockingham County was kind of the thing for last year, and the legacy of Charles Watson Wentworth, who was the first Marquess of Rockingham. So it was named after him. There was a debate, and I was racking through my notes in my brain to try and figure out what the other contender for Rockingham County was, because it was either Rockingham County or another name, and I can't remember for the life of me what it is. I'll have to find out and do a post on it, unless you know off the top of your head, Charlie.
No, I don't.
But they settled on Rockingham because he was a great supporter of American rights, especially towards the end of the war. And unfortunately, he died very prematurely into his prime ministership of Great Britain, of an influenza epidemic. But his kind of legacy to recognize the United States and all that he'd done in the 20 years prior to that, pretty much, has seen him in good favor with a lot of the colonists. So it kind of was a popular figure to name counties. We're actually not the only one. There are other counties, not just in America, but Canada, named after him as well. But one of those connections was Wentworth Woodhouse, where he grew up, that we made from last year's gala. And you know, they're very excited to kind of carry on those connections, and have been talking about potential projects for the future, one of which was transcribing some of their family archives. So it's still very early days. We're very much keen to get into that, but that could be a great opportunity for anyone who may be listening tonight, or people that you may know, to help get involved with us, with our archive efforts, and that project as well, which will be interesting, especially since it was a private family home for 300 years thereabouts, and so no one's really seen these archives. So there could be some very interesting things in there, as well as our own archives. You know, we're going through a kind of reorganization of our entire archive, and we're rediscovering and discovering new things as well. So it's a great time to volunteer and get involved. I've got to plug our volunteer efforts.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Charlie, so much for the history. Really appreciate it. Marguerite just said you are a treasure, Charlie. I hope I don't embarrass Marguerite with that one, but her husband Clark Holt spent many hours in the vault searching titles, and thought it was great to learn a bit more about the history. So thank you. But if anyone does have any other questions, you can always email me. If I don't know the answer, I will forward it on to Charlie. But feel free to. And the recording will be available on our YouTube channel, as all of ours have been since partway through last year. So you'll be able to view that in the coming weeks if you'd like to again. So, well, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. We really do appreciate it. And thank you, Charlie, as well, for a great presentation. So without further ado, have a lovely evening and take care. And hope to see you with another program soon. All right. Bye-bye.